Okay, good morning, people, everybody. So good morning and welcome to this Pensions Committee. I'm obliged to inform you that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded. Members of the public will be able to view the meeting using the link on the agenda. This is a meeting held in public, but not a public meeting. I will just go around the room now and introduce who's actually here. I'm Councillor Gary Groves, Chair of the Pensions Committee.
I'm Pete Chadson. I'm the Pensions Investment and Responsible Investment Manager.
I'm Philip Hudson. I'm the Independent Advisor to the Committee.
I'm Sarah Townsend. I'm the Committee Officer.
Bashar Saleh, LGPS Central Responsible Investment Manager.
Ethan Phipps, Responsible Investment Analyst, LGPS Central.
David Burton, Assistant Branch Secretary for Unison, Employee Representative.
Charles Shackley-Bennett, Councillor for Quay.
Malcolm Marsook, Councillor for Priest.
Alan Holford, Councillor for Wen.
Zona Hallington, Councillor for Lawley.
Byron Cook, GMB Employment Representative.
Colin Cartwright, Investment Advisor from Aon.
Vicky Jenks, Pensions Administration Manager.
Thank you. So apologies and substitutions. So we've received apologies from Councillor Paul Davis. No others now. And welcome to the new committee member, David Burton. David has replaced Paul Griffiths as the cooperative member, non-voting, as the employee representative for Shropshire Council. And one note just before we carry on. Sadly, Brian Williams, who was a pension committee, he's been on the committee for a number of years, since 2017, has sadly passed away. So just our thoughts are with his family, and we thanked him for his service to the committee. Thank you. Item 2, disclosable interest. Members are reminded that they must declare their disclosable pecuniary interest and other registrable or non-registrable interests in any matter being considered at the meeting as set out as Appendix B of the Members' Code of Conduct, and consider if they should leave the room prior to the item being considered. Are there any? No? Okay, thank you. Item 3, meetings of the previous minute. To approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 19th of September. Those for those? Malcolm, seconded. Zona, thank you. All in favour? That's majority. Thank you. Public questions. So we had 3 public questions have been received, and the first one, Dr. Jamie Russell, if you would like to come forward, please, and ask your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, councillors and committee members. There's recently been extensive calls for the Shropshire County Pension Fund to divest from companies involved in the genocide in Gaza and those firms fueling climate breakdown through continued fossil fuel expansion against the scientific advice of leading experts, e.g. companies like Shell and BP. Given this, can the committee please confirm, firstly, when it last actively asked employers who pay into the fund for their views on these controversial investment issues? Number 2, whether the fund values the views of employers on these specific issues? And number 3, how employers should best feed in their views on these issues in the absence of active engagement by the fund? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. And the response on behalf of the fund is question 1. Whilst the fund has not specifically requested employers' views on controversial investment issues, the fund regularly engages with employers and holds an annual employers' meeting at which employers can raise any concerns. In respect of question 2, given that employers are the primary risk holders in the fund, in respect of investment performance, we hold regular engagements with them. And in respect of question 3, as noted above, employer engagement is open to all employers.
Thank you. Question 2 is from Mr. Paul Cooper. Mr. Cooper present. Pardon? Okay, sorry. So the question will be asked. Thank you.
Question 2 from Mr. Paul Cooper. I write on behalf of a group of pension fund members who would like to ask a question at the meeting on the 5th of December. Following press reports that the Shropshire County Pension Fund has 142 million invested in companies linked to the genocide in Gaza, we write as fund members. We want to ask why, and our 50,000 fellow members are not being properly consulted or given a choice on how our pension contributions are invested. During the last pension committee meeting, a question was raised by Councillor Malcolm Mileshook about actively engaging with members on the issue. In response, the committee chair, Councillor Gary Groves, replied, "It's like any kind of survey, isn't it, that you do? Be careful what you ask for because you might get the answer that you don't want. Then if you don't act on that, you're seen not to be acting on what members want." Later, Councillor Charles Shackley Bennett stated the argument that the fund belongs to people who are going to receive pensions is fallacious in a sense. The fund guarantees their pensions. It is fundamentally underwritten by the council. Any shortfalls are met by the council. It is our money rather than the individual pensioners. Given there have been no in-person AGMs for several years, and there is currently no members representative on the committee, we are asking for members to be urgently consulted on how their pension contributions are being invested. We have no wish to be complicit in genocide.
And the response, please.
Thank you again. And the response on behalf of the fund is: the fund reviewed the £142 million of investments identified by the Palestine Solidarity Campaign as supporting Israel in the September meeting at item 10 in the Public Corporate Governance Report. As stated in that report, the majority of companies relate to global multinational companies, and in terms of direct investment, only 5.5 million at the 30th of June 2025 was directly invested in Israeli companies. The committee have a fiduciary responsibility to run the fund on behalf of their stakeholders. In respect of those stakeholders, only employer contributions are variable, i.e. only employers are impacted from any The committee have a fiduciary responsibility to run the fund on behalf of their stakeholders. In respect of those stakeholders, only employer contributions are variable, i.e. only employers are impacted from any under or overperformance of the fund's investment strategy. Employee pensions are guaranteed and employee contribution rates fixed, irrespective of investment performance. The fund has regular engagement with employers, including an annual meeting with employers. To date, no employer outside of Shropshire Council has requested divestment of any of the fund's investments. The fund's investment policies have led to a fully funded scheme which has enabled many employers to see reduced contribution levels, protecting local jobs. Thank you.
Can I just ask you to turn your microphone on, and then members of the public who are listening, hit the right hand button.
At the national emergency briefing on the climate and nature crisis held last week on the 27th of November, 10 of the UK's leading experts briefed an invite-only audience of over 1,200 politicians and leaders from business, culture, faith, sport and the media, with the latest implications for health, food, national security and the economy. Leading experts warned that we face unprecedented societal and ecological collapse, including starvation, economic collapse, civil unrest and wars if we don't take decisive action to limit further global warming and preserve nature. Paul Behrens at the University of Oxford said, Britain has seen 3 of the 5 worst cereal harvests on record occur this decade. Things could get so bad that it leads to civil unrest. We face a choice. We can continue with business as usual, watching our food systems crumble, and then bracing ourselves for political and civil unrest, or we can act now. The emergency briefing concluded that we need a World War II level of leadership as if the survival of our society depends on it, because it does. Will the Pensions Committee arrange a special meeting to watch the film of the emergency briefing and discuss how the committee can play their role as part of this World War II level of leadership? Thank you.
And the response, please.
Thank you. And the response on behalf of the fund is, at the time of this response, the video of the national briefing event was not available to watch on the link provided. However, the site said that it will be updated shortly. Members and officers have been provided with the link so that they can, if they wish, view the video when available. If requested by members, the fund will make time at one of the investment strategy events in January 2026 to allow further discussion on any of the matters arising from the video. The fund also takes this opportunity to confirm that it fully recognises the risk of climate change to both investment performance and stakeholders. However, we also understand that divestment at this time will have no impact upon real-world carbon emissions. Divestment, therefore, will only increase the risk to the fund as it reduces the voice of responsible and concerned investors. The fund is dedicated to responsible corporate ownership and trying to use its influence through partners such as LGPS Central and the Local Authority Pension Fund Forum to influence company behaviour to meet the targets set out in the Paris Agreement, which are in line with the fund's climate strategy, which is available on the fund's website.
Just for information, can I say that there are films of each of the individual 10 experts, and they will be available on YouTube in the next week, and early next year a film will be available that summarises the entire national emergency briefing. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. And I'd just firstly like to thank members of the public for attending this meeting today. It is good that you do attend, to, get answers to your questions, rather than just write in and then we give an answer. It's great that you have turned up today. I don't think we've had this many people at a pensions meeting for a long time. So thank you very much for turning out on this cold day today for the meeting. So we are going to move on. Please feel free to stay as long as you like until we're in the public session. But if you do need to leave, please just feel free to leave. Okay, so item 5, valuation and funding strategy statement update. And Michelle Dorman and Mark Wilson from Mercer will present this item.
Thank you very much. If I can just share the short presentation that we have. 1 second, please. Can you see the presentation on the screen now? Can I just check, please?
Yes, we can, Mark.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I am Mark Wilson. With me is my colleague Michelle Dorman, and together we act as actuaries to the pension fund, and we're here today to give an update on the 2025 valuation. Sorry, I'm not sure if anyone else is getting feedback when I'm speaking. I shall press him. Firstly, I'm going to run through the 2025 valuation results and outcomes. After that, Michelle will take you through the changes to the funding strategy statement. And at the end, we'll have time for any questions that need to be asked. Okay, so firstly, into the 2025 valuation. As a brief recap, at the last valuation, we were just shy of 100% funded. It was a positive valuation, and another one on the back of several. Since then, overall, it's been a positive 3 years and the fund position has improved. What we have on the screen here is the key drivers of the changes since last time, and it's worth just delving into them separately. So firstly, the fund's investment performance over the 3 years. The fund return, has been 14.4%, which is positive. However, this is slightly below the actuarial assumption of 4.8% a year. In isolation, this has acted to reduce the funding level by around about 1%. It's worth just noting there that given the way the evaluation is structured and given the reliance on future investment returns, that it's not enough to have positive returns here. The returns have to beat the actuarial assumptions to maintain the funding position and so in theory maintain contributions. So the first thing to note there is that reliance we have on future investment return as part of our long-term funding plan. Secondly, something you'll be well familiar with, the high levels of inflation since the last time. All of the benefits in the scheme are linked to CPI inflation directly or indirectly, mostly directly. Over the last 3 years, inflation has been very high, as you know. The pension increase in 2023 was 10.1%. In 2024, it was 6.7%. So over the course of just over 12 months, all of the future cash flows, all of the future benefit payments of the scheme increased by around about 17%. Now, this was expected and it was known as part of the last valuation, but it does illustrate quite clearly the high level of exposure that the fund has to inflation going forward, and it illustrates the damage that unexpected periods of high inflation can have on our funding position. If we look at this in isolation compared to the long-term inflation assumption over the last 3 years, this has caused the funding level to reduce by around about 5%. So those are two negatives in terms of funding impact. There are also two measurable factors. The big positive is something that requires a little bit more judgment, and that is the expected future investment returns going forward have increased quite significantly from the last valuation. Now, you're aware of the drivers of this. Interest rates are up, bond yields are up, and beyond that, there's an expectation that this will feed into higher future investment returns generally. However, this involves some judgment, as I say, in terms of how much credit do we take now for these future investment returns that we think are going to be higher, but we haven't actually achieved yet. The balance here is the more credit you take for them, then the better your funding position and the lower your contributions. But the higher that hurdle rate that you have to achieve with your investment returns going forward to make sure that your funding plan stays on track. If you take less credit, if you hold back a little, then that target becomes a little easier to achieve and you have a bit less risk within your funding plan. And so there's a judgment there, and we've worked quite a lot with the fund officers and we've presented to yourselves on this issue to decide exactly where to pitch that future assumed investment return. And just to be clear, in summary, in total, these are positive factors and the funding position is improved. It's been a good 3-year cycle since the last valuation. So if I can temper that good news with a little bit of historical context, this is the funding position as it's progressed over this century. As you can see at the start of the century, the funding level was quite low, and we had a difficult 10 years or so where it actually fell to a low point of 76% in 2013. Since then, the position's rallied nicely. As I say, got to nearly fully funded at the last valuation, and contributions have reduced along with that. A couple of things to note here. There's a reason we're showing you this historical context. Firstly, it's to illustrate that the funding position can and will move around. It's not fixed and it doesn't only go in one direction. I certainly wouldn't want to say that the funding position now is the lowest it will ever be. It's certainly possible that it could reduce. You can see that here. It's also worth noting what's driven this improvement over the last 10 years or so. It's two main factors. The first is strong investment performance by the fund, but also investment markets have been very good generally over the last decade or so. What we can't rely on is that to necessarily continue going forward. There's a lot of investment risk that the fund is exposed to quite significantly. And while it's been a good 10 years or so, that can certainly turn against us. So there's risk there. The other driver of that improvement is the significant contributions that the employers have paid into the fund, including a lot in deficit contributions to remove that deficit. Contributions have been as high as 22% following the 2013 valuation, and that included 8.2% of pay in deficit contributions. Now, one of the key things we've been looking at this valuation is how can we make sure, as much as we reasonably can, noting that nothing can be guaranteed, how can we limit the chance that we have to go back to that level of contributions in the future? What can we do to make sure that these improvements stick and that contributions stay, as much as we reasonably can hope, as low as reasonably possible, to make sure that the reductions we're talking about this valuation stick. So that's a key focus at this valuation, that contribution stability. So the way we achieve that is through the valuation funding plan and the parameters. There's a huge amount of parameters. The key ones are on the screen here. So the first one is the real discount rate, just a fancy way of saying the future investment return above inflation. Very broadly speaking, you can think that your assets as a fund grow in line with investment returns. Your liabilities will grow in line with inflation because all your benefits are linked to inflation. And so the difference between your investment returns and your inflation is the key driver of cost. That's the key driver of what the benefits actually cost to provide. And so our assumption of that return is the key driver of funding position and contributions. And as I said before, the higher we assume, then the lower the contributions, but the more risk we take on. The second parameter is the sustainability reserve, which is a new one at this valuation. As we move into surplus, we have to consider how best to use that surplus in the long term. The idea here is that the first X% of surplus, whatever that may be, is held back. So instead of using it to further reduce contributions, you hold it within the fund as a margin or a buffer, whatever you want to call it, to keep contributions more stable and to limit any future increases. So in simple terms, if the funding level falls in the future, instead of just having to put contributions up, we can first turn to the reserve to absorb some of that negative experience. The third key parameter is the recovery period. We're a long-term fund, so when there's a deficit or a surplus to be recovered, we don't just write checks or just ask employers to write checks on day one. These things are removed over a period of time. Fundamentally, the longer that period is, the more stable your contributions are. So your recovery period is another way to control the stability of contributions, which is key and which has always been a long-term fund priority, stable contributions. Now, the table at the bottom shows the impact of change in those different parameters. I won't go through it all. I'll just note the discount rate, the investment return, just to give you an idea of the level of exposure there. So a 0.1% a year change in investment returns or assumed investment returns, which in the grand scheme of things over the life of the fund is nothing. That changes contributions by the best part of 1.5% of pay. So that really illustrates the level of exposure that we have here. And the other two factors can be quite impactful as well. Now, having been through each of those parameters individually, this is where I would say you shouldn't consider them individually. It doesn't really matter too much as such which one or the other is, because changes to one can offset the other and you can arrive at the same contributions. What's important here is the overall level of prudence, the level of protection that's within the funding plan, and what that means for contributions. So you really need to consider these things as a whole or as a package overall. So, as I've already said a couple of times now, the funding position has improved. We're moving into surplus, and this is obviously a good thing. But you have the question now, what do we do with that surplus? How do we use it? And on the funding side, there are two fundamental uses. Either you hold it within the fund to increase stability, or you return it to the employers via lower contributions, or more likely, as we are doing, you do some combination of the above. So the question becomes, where do you strike that balance? And there is no one right answer to that. There's a range of potential outcomes that are acceptable depending on your priorities as a fund and how much you want to prioritize different things. In terms of the arguments for more or less stability and higher, lower contributions, the big argument I think for holding something back is the risk of cutting contributions too far and then having to reverse it. So this is something that the fund and all LGPS funds have wrestled with at this valuation. I'm sure you can see the issue here. If you cut contributions too far, that money is going to then disappear into core budgets. And if you have to reverse those cuts in 2 or 3 years, 2 or 3 valuation cycles, then you can do real damage to the employers. If you cut your contributions too far, it's not unrealistic at all to think they might have to double in 3 years or 6 years' time. In the meantime, that money is gone into core budgets, and the only way the employers can get it back is to slash core services, and you can do real damage, which is something the fund absolutely wants to avoid. Other arguments for stability Firstly, there's guidance in the regulations that steers you towards stable contributions. Stable primary contributions in respect of new benefits earned are an absolute requirement that's stated in the regulations. Beyond that, there's a requirement to secure the solvency of the scheme, the long-term cost efficiency. All of this steers you towards stability. There's also the idea of intergenerational fairness. The way the scheme works in practice is we grant these benefits today, we as a society, but it's future generations that have to make sure that they get paid. And so to meet the requirements of cost efficiency and the moral obligations, there is a requirement on the fund to make sure those benefits are as well funded as we reasonably can, to limit as much as we can the chance that future generations have to pay for the benefits that we're awarding. And then, of course, there's all the long-term risks that the scheme is exposed to: inflation risk, investment risk, economic risks, all of these impacted by climate change, which can impact all of the fund's operations in a negative way, potentially all at the same time. So we have significant long-term risk exposure. Now, on the funding side, all we can do to guard against those risks is to hold more money in the scheme so that if they do start to impact the funding level, then we can call on those margins, whatever we've held back, to absorb negative experience instead of just having to ask the employers for more at a point in time where potentially they're not able to provide it. That said, there are also arguments for lower contributions, for sure. The big one I'm sure you're all familiar with is the current affordability challenges that employers are facing. We've spoken to many employers within the fund. Michelle and I have spoken to employers up and down the land and other funds as well. And the message is clear that funding is challenging for all public organisations. And given that, the fund shouldn't be taking more money than it really needs to at a time when employers really can't afford to give it. Related to that, I've spoken about prudence and intergenerational fairness, and those things are very important, but you can certainly take those arguments too far. So you can always look for a little bit more certainty. You can always find another risk to worry about. You can always find a reason not to cut contributions and keep them within the fund. And if you take that too far, you actually run the risk of overfunding. So you turn around in 9 years, 12 years time, and your funding level's 250% or whatever it may be, and your employers are on your knees because you spent 10 years taking money from them that you didn't particularly need and they couldn't afford. So there is a risk of overfunding, and that needs to be recognised as well. There's also an element of government oversight here, principally via the Government Actuaries Department, who do something called a Section 13 report, where they look after the valuation at the approach taken by the funds. And one of the key things they're looking at this time is the use of surplus to make sure that neither too much nor too little is being returned to employers now versus held in the fund for the longer term. So all these factors need to be considered when we're setting a suitable contribution plan that strikes a balance between the needs of employers now and the long-term risks and short-term risks that the fund is exposed to. Excuse me. So, having talked for a while, here's some results. On the left-hand side, we've got the position at the last valuation. As I say, it was positive then. Very small deficit, 22 million, small in context. We were 99% funded. In terms of the contributions employers are paying right now, they're paying 19.1% of pay in total. 18.4% of that is in respect of new benefits being earned, and 0.7% in respect of that deficit to remove the deficit. Fast forward to the new valuation, and the position's improved quite significantly. We now have a healthy surplus of 335 million, equivalent to a funding level, assets divided by liabilities, of 115%. What this means for contributions: primary contributions are down from 18.4 to 15.7, principally driven by changes in assumptions. Secondary contributions are now negative, i.e. returning surplus to employers, and so total contributions, fund average, a lot of variation around this, employer to employer, I should say, but on average, contributions have fallen from around 19.1% to around about 13% on average under the proposed funding plan. In terms of the drivers of that, you can see the big one at the top, the real discount rates. That's the real assumed future investment returns that I spoke about earlier. You can see how much they've increased, and that's a measure of how much additional credit we're taking for those increases in assumed future investment returns. So the past service discount rate, which drives the funding level and the secondary contributions, is going up from 1.7% above inflation to 3%. Future service discount rate's not increasing quite as much. There we've got a little bit of an eye on the requirement in the regulations to keep that rate as stable as possible, but that's still increasing from 2.1 to 2.5. And together they act to increase the funding level and reduce the contributions. The other things to note, the main one is the sustainability reserve. So that's been set at 10%. So what that means is the first 10% of surplus is retained within the fund. So if you're 115% funded, as we are on average, it's the last 5% of surplus that is being used to drive contributions down by returning that to the employers. And then the smoothing period has been reduced slightly from last time, which has an effect of increasing the contribution reductions a little bit. I think to view this in total, I would see it as quite an extreme valuation in some ways, or certainly significant changes, I think it's fair to say. So we've had a significant improvement in funding level, as you can see there. We've had quite the increase in prudence. And then on top of that, we've got a very significant reduction in contributions. So the reduction in contributions is roughly a third, in cash terms to employers, which hopefully will be significantly beneficial to their operations. But with the increase in prudence as well, we're giving ourselves as good a chance as we reasonably can of making sure that those reductions stick, or if they have to increase in the future, we're able to increase them in a very controlled and sensible way. So we're limiting the chance that we have to have big uncontrolled reductions in contributions in the future. And that's the balance we've tried to strike between the needs of the now and the needs of the future. So just a little bit more on the reserve and how it would work in practice. So what we have there is a little bit of modelling of how things may look at future valuations. So we take the position now, the proposed plan from the previous page, and we project it forward to the next two valuations. Now, if we keep everything the same reserve, same assumptions, etc. at the next valuation, then the chances that contributions go up or down is roughly 50-50. A little bit more than 50% chance that they stay the same, a little bit less that they go up. But in practice, if we did get to the next valuation and it was looking like contribution increases might be needed, then instead of just turning around and increasing those contributions, we can first turn to the sustainability reserve. So if we use half of it, for example, then the chances that we can keep those contributions at 13% or less increases to around about 60%. And if that's not enough, we can use the full reserve, and then the chances that we can keep contributions stable increases to around about 65 to 70%. And if they did have to go up, we can use the reserve to limit those increases as well. So this is what the reserve is for. This is essentially what it buys you. It buys you more stability, more options in the future to prevent or limit any contribution increases. I think that's it from me. I'll pass you over to Michelle now, who will run you through some specifics around the policy points, and we'll also cover the funding strategy statement. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here virtually this morning. So Mark's talked you through the kind of key highlights to the funding progression, the policies that apply to set contributions and how that impacts the fund as a whole. But there's a wider perspective that needs to be considered as part of the valuation too. So, the fund, we've talked about results at the whole fund level, but the fund comprises many individual employers that have different circumstances, different requirements, and different sort of financial ability to meet contributions, and present a different level of risk. And so as part of the valuation process, there's also a comprehensive review of the wider policies in the fund that relate to contributions and contribution requirements in other circumstances, as well as at the valuation. So we've got here 3 key areas that have been considered in some depth as part of the 2025 valuation, before we come on to the wider policies documented within the funding strategy statement. So I'll just give you a high level overview of these, and for those that have seen the training, you'll will have heard about some of these in a bit more depth. So the first one is dealing with a category of employers in the fund that aren't backed by taxpayers, who can exit the fund. We call them lower risk employers, on the grounds that these employers, the fund adopts a lower risk approach because ultimately they present more risk to the fund. Essentially, the risk is that these employers can terminate the fund, and if they can't afford to meet the costs of all the future benefits, those costs have to be met by all the remaining employers. And so to manage this risk, the fund applies a different approach, a more prudent funding approach to assessing contributions for these employers unless a bond is required that will pay out in the event of a termination. Now, this is not new. This is something that was introduced and worked successfully since the last valuation. But as Mark has spoken through, we're in quite a different environment at the moment. We're in an environment of improved funding levels that has allowed the fund to take more prudence in the standard approach whilst also reducing employer contributions. And what that's meant is that that's been good news for this type of employer in that it's allowed the fund to take apply adopt an approach that's more aligned to standard employers rather than layering on top the additional prudence margins it did before. So there's been some relaxation. There's still additional prudence in there, but some relaxation. It also, for many, if not all of these employers, the security they would have otherwise needed to provide has actually dropped down to zero because they're fully funded on a very prudent basis. So that's a good news outcome for those employers. The second approach follows the termination policy follows a similar theme. So for these employers, as I mentioned, they can exit the fund. When they do so, they essentially crystallise their liabilities. They settle their liabilities, and the fund can't return to them if the costs turn out to be different from the assumptions made at that point. And therefore, as you would expect, the fund needs to take quite a careful approach to manage the risk that, for example, future investment returns or life expectancy is different to the assumptions made, and therefore sort of a higher target is applied for those employers exiting the fund to make sure those liabilities are covered and to protect all other employers in the fund of having to meet additional costs if the liabilities weren't covered. So as part of this valuation, given the material change in market conditions, the fund has undertaken a comprehensive review of the termination policy to ensure it remains appropriate in terms of balancing risk, but also fairness for exiting employers. And then the final policy covered here relates to academies. So this is bringing the policy up to date in the situation where schools are converting to academy status. So the overriding principle is one of seeking to retain a consistent contribution for academies post-conversion as was applied for schools prior to conversion. And that philosophy is one that is applied in the fund for a long time and is consistent with national expectations. However, due to the review of the funding approach and the introduction of the sustainability reserve, the approach for academy conversion is needed to be updated to reflect that. So that's bringing the policy up to date. So Mark, if you just turn over, we'll just touch briefly on the funding strategy statement. So yeah, so turn over one more page. So as part of the valuation, as I mentioned, as well as the ongoing contribution requirement, there's a number of other policies that are reviewed, and all of this needs to be documented in a funding strategy statement. Since the last valuation, the guidance around the FSS has been reviewed and updated materially. And so that's meant quite a change to the fund's documentation this time round to ensure it remains in line with the new guidance. It's fair to say that the guidance hadn't been reviewed for nearly 10 years. So, there were a lot of changes, to bring it up to date. And so what we've got here is a snapshot of the Shropshire Fund's FSS in terms of what it comprises. So essentially there's a core section that covers the fund's approach around the key areas in line with the guidance, followed by all the fund's policies relating to funding, and you can see there are a number of those covered as appendices. Many of these aren't new. It's just bringing it all together into a single document, whereas previously it was documented across an employer events policy as well as the smaller or briefer funding strategy statement. We have highlighted here what is new and what has been updated. So, firstly, the fund didn't previously have a policy devoted to how surplus would be assessed and how contribution reductions would be applied. But as you've heard from Mark, the very strong funding position has meant the whole fund is in surplus at this valuation, and also a number of individual employers now are in surplus too. And so there's a separate policy focusing on how surplus contribution reductions will be applied in the event that employers are in surplus. And that covers the points that Mark talked about earlier about the sustainability reserve, the period over which offsets are applied, and sort of how that will be reviewed at each valuation. There's also mentioned there an asset share policy. Now, that's not actually changing anything that the fund does, but it's in response to managing the need to manage auditor queries around the detailed process for allocating the total fund assets across all the individual employers in the fund as part of individual employers' accounting process. They typically will see queries from auditors around that. So the idea in the FSS is to make sure that that policy is clearly documented to resolve those queries. It's also fair to say, in the event of, the improved funding levels and the surplus environment, how the assets are allocated across employers is getting an increasing amount of attention. So again, drawing this out in a very clear way helps resolve and close down any queries in that area. The other policies are more just update. So the deficit recovery policy, the key thing to point out here is although there's been significant improvement since the last valuation, some employers still have a deficit, albeit their position has typically improved since last time. Now, in order to manage the long-term stability objective in terms of keeping contributions steady over the long term, the fund has introduced a minimum period for recovering deficits. The idea being that if the recovery period gets too short, then as deficits can increase as well as reduce at times, then the secondary contribution can become very volatile. But by having a reasonable minimum spread period for ongoing employers, you manage that stability. So there's been a minimum period of 12 years for employers that are expected to remain in the fund in the long term to support stability. The admission and termination policies have been covered on the other slide, as has the employer risk management policy. The only other thing to reference here is the notifiable events framework. So this is a framework where, it does what it says on the tin. It provides employers clear guidance for circumstances that they should make the fund aware. And the idea is that if there's a material change in employer liabilities or a material change in an employer's ability to finance the benefits, the fund needs to know, because in some circumstances it can be appropriate to review contributions between valuations to manage risk. It's also in employers' interests to make the fund aware as well. And so there's the policy around notifiable events has just been extended to fully detail the types and circumstances when employers are expected to engage. So if we just turn to the final slide now before questions, this is more about sort of process, and I'll touch on next steps. So the first thing about the funding strategy statement is that once drafted, it needs to be shared with all employers as part of a consultation process. So the consultation will start in the coming days following committee's consideration of the draft. The new guidance is very clear around the importance of that consultation process and supporting employer engagement as part of the valuation. And if you think about it, actually, if employers are well informed about how contributions are set and also the risk of change, then that puts employers in the best position to be able to understand their costs and manage them over the longer term. Which ultimately then helps the fund manage risk as well, because the employers it puts them in a better position to be able to finance the benefits ultimately. So there's a real benefit to the fund in having a robust engagement process too. Now, for the Shropshire Fund, there's been a comprehensive approach. So employers have had guidance videos along the way, supporting around what to expect, the funding strategy statement more generally and around their results. There's been employer meetings, both group meetings and presentations from Mark and myself, as well as the opportunity to have individual one-to-one discussions around their individual positions. There's also sort of an FAQ document provided to employers, again, to support some of those common queries to help them work through their results. Once employers have considered their results, so they've got until the end of January to feed back, both in relation to the funding strategy as a whole, and also to sort of sign off on their contributions. There is, the committee need to review and consider those responses received. And there's an expectation that there's sort of clear signposting as to how employer responses have been taken into account in the final strategy. But nothing has changed in the sense that the backstop, the ultimate decision is for committee on the funding strategy. This is a consultation. Once the consultation is complete, the next steps really are around documentation. So, as I say, employers' results will be finalised, and then Mark and myself will certify them in the rates and adjustment certificate, confirming the rates payable from 2026 through to 29, and the valuation report will be published. And that all needs to be completed by 31st of March next year. So not that long to go now, although we're a good way through the process. So that sort of takes us to the end of the slides. We'll now just pause to see if there's any questions. It was quite a quick canter through, but many of these themes you'll be familiar with as part of the, following on from the training.
Great, so thank you very much both for that good presentation. Questions? We got Alan and Malcolm.
Hi, Councillor Alan Holford. I was just wondering, what is the market exposure of our employees, i.e. when market forces or the investment landscape produce a deficit in the fund, as we saw it went down to 76% at one point, is it also true at that point that employers are likely to be facing more financial pressure and therefore be struggling to make higher contributions? And does this influence the size of our sustainability buffer when we are in surplus?
So, yeah. Sorry, Mark and I are both jumping to answer that. So I'll jump in. I'll jump in first. Give Mark's voice the rest. So you're right. So I think what you're describing is systemic risk. The fact that the risk that the funding position falls at the same time as employer affordability falls, and that's really important and has been considered as part of the valuation process in terms of looking at scenarios and ensuring that balance that Mark talked about between prudence and sort of shorter term contribution reductions for employers is struck in the right place. I think the best way of talking through this, if I could ask Mark, if you would mind just popping up that slide about the sustainability reserve. This is where the prudence kicks in to protect employers. So this is where there's a few levers. So what this slide is showing on, just to recap, on the top right hand corner is kind of the risks, taking into account the sort of stochastic modeling, the risks of things changing in the future. But actually, if you look at the bottom part of the table, the bottom part of the slide, it's not quite that simple, because if markets decline and employer finances are constricted, it's not a given if markets decline that contributions necessarily go up, because of the additional prudence margins the fund has been able to incorporate at this valuation to balance that sustainability and risk. So we talked about the sustainability reserve, which is like the first line of defence, but also the prudence within the investment return assumptions. So the fund doesn't look at the best estimate returns from the assets in the future and make an assumption that they will be delivered year after year after year. The fund takes a haircut on those best estimate returns, and that haircut is a prudent haircut to allow considerable room for for deviance over the shorter terms. Now, there's still risk, because we can't assume zero investment returns, because those contributions would be unaffordable. But there is that protection there to manage that position. But ultimately, it is a key systemic risk that we can't completely lock down. The nature of the funding is that risk has to be taken.
Great, thank you. And I just had another question on the mechanics of it all, really. So the surplus and deficit graph was all about total liabilities and total assets. What's the sort of cash flow position in terms of how is the drawdown of current pensioners afforded versus the contributions that are taken in and the investment returns?
Yeah, so that's all taken into account, as you would hope, and I'll explain how. So I think what you're alluding to, it's absolutely right, is we've had 3 years of really high inflation, and so pensions which are linked to inflation have increased by 20% before you even allow for new retirements, just by dint to that very high inflation. And then at the same time, we're going into a period of asking employers for lower contributions, because the returns have been good and the assets are enough there to support the benefits. And so there's a cash flow impact. There's a reduced cash coming in. And whilst I don't have the numbers to hand, at some point it could turn the fund into a disinvestor rather than an investor, depending on how those balance of contributions versus cash flows lie. That in itself isn't a problem, because the assets are there to pay for the benefits. But what is important, and what the fund is very aware of, is the need to link back to the investment strategy to ensure that the investment strategy has enough liquidity so that you're not hostage to fortune in terms of disinvesting, for example, from very risky assets at a low point. And then there's a cost in terms of the return that you miss out on by being a hostage to fortune. So it feeds through in terms of the types of investments that the fund would look towards to manage the changing in liquidity needs, which is very much considered. And then there's a feedback loop again, to the extent that the assets are changed, does that impact the return expectations for the long term? And typically these are they are more around the edges, but they are thought about.
Great, thanks very much for your clear answers.
Can I come in there as well? So in the new year, we'll be looking at investment strategy back on the results from what Michelle and Mark have presented here. The two of the key things we look at on investment strategy are returns hitting the discount rate and the return requirements provided by the actuary. And then the other piece is, can we adjust our portfolio to look at that cash flow and make sure we're generating enough income to supplement the contributions coming in? That's what we'll be doing. We've done some work in the background now with the officers and with Philip already. That's what we're working with the committee in the strategy sessions in January next year. And, you know, Aon and Mercers have spoken to each other about our thinking to make sure it is all joined up and right. So it all comes into the loop through the process.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question, I think, for Mark on slide 4. The first one is on the key factors. Obviously, recognising the strong position of the fund, a very simplistic view I'll take on this. This diagram says, historically, we were over-optimistic, and the 2 red ones say, actually, that shows we were over-optimistic. However, the good news is we're optimistic about the future. So I guess my question is, how do we learn the lessons of the past and prevent optimism bias for the future?
It's a good question. Yes. I should firstly say, as actuaries, we're never right. So whatever we predict in terms of our assumptions, it's vanishingly rare that they actually come to pass. They're always a little bit under or over. Ultimately, we are trying to predict the future. And we don't kid ourselves that we're able to do that. So in reality, we set sensible assumptions. The first thing I would say is we set long-term assumptions. We wouldn't necessarily expect them to come to pass in the short term, and we expect to see a lot more volatility there. So the fact that, frankly, the investment performance was that close is a little surprising. Normally, we would expect to see more volatility than that. We're setting a long-term funding plan, and so we try and set long-term assumptions that we think are sensible over a large sweep of time. Short-term variation is to be expected. That said, the point you're making is absolutely correct. There is a risk that if you're too optimistic in your assumptions, then you can't achieve them in practice. And if you don't achieve them, then you get into some of the things we've talked about, where your funding level falls and your contributions essentially have to increase. What you do to guard against that is you have, as we've talked about, prudence within your assumptions and funding parameters. And the more prudence you have, the more prudent you are being, then the greater the chance that you will exceed or overachieve against your plan, and so that your contributions will prove to be sufficient or better. So in this case, while we've increased the discount rates, so the discount rates are higher in absolute terms, we're actually not taking nearly as much credit as we could have for the improvements we've seen over the last 3 years. So relative to our modelling and relative to market indicators, like, for example, interest rates, those discount rates are in some ways more prudent than they were last time. So while we're taking some credit for those improved future returns, we're not taking nearly as much as we could have. So there's a certain amount of safety or amount being held back there. Also, then we've got the introduction of the buffer, which is another element of prudence, which again can give us protection if short-term or longer-term experience is not as we hoped. And so some of those margins are getting eroded elsewhere. We can also call on the funding reserve to absorb some of that negative experience. So this is all you can do ultimately within your funding plan to address that risk. You hold back margins, you apply prudence so that the targets you're setting yourself are not as high and you have a greater chance of achieving them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the older I get, actually, the more pessimistic I become. So take some comfort out of that I'm watching it in that sort of way. I haven't quite arrived at the Eeyore stage of it's all over now, but I'm getting there. Now, look, just a couple of observations looking through this. Okay, the actuarial world is a dark art. So an awful lot of what we see in here, the number of times I've asked actuaries to explain how they arrive at discount rates, and frankly, they've got to be honest and say it's a guess. Actually, okay, we'll be fair, it's an educated guess. So a lot of these things can move and will change. I am concerned that we're looking at an average contribution rate reducing some 5.9%. What's gone up has been as a result of 2 things: luck and good management. And thankfully, that's taken us a long way. Luck, to a degree, is the increase in interest rates. So in a sense, that's outside of our control. The good management bit is and around asset allocation, and as Colin refers to, obviously working through this. For the fund, it was helped by the fact that we increased our exposure to equities. We've got that right if we look back at the work that's been done historically and that has helped lift the boat to a higher level. What I would say is, and it's to Alan's point very much, is that, look, back in April, our funding level got absolutely murdered for a few days, and that can happen. We're in it for the long term, so we've got to sort of take these long-term assumptions, but also members need to be aware that we can get into some pretty rough water at times. Does the funding level matter? Yes, of course it does. Now, there are implications working through from this, and again, Colin's alluded to it, is reduced employer contributions means we're actually going to have to work pretty hard together next year to actually sort out making sure that we bolster the cash that comes out of our investments. So there will probably have to be changes to our asset allocation flowing from this. That's not the actuary's job, that's our job, to take forward what they're saying and actually then put that into practice. But it's encouraging to see us say, I know employers love to see reduced contribution levels, and actually aspirationally, wouldn't it be wonderful to arrive at a point where the fund is effectively self-funded? We're not there yet, and you know, that is I can only suggest a long-term aspiration. But I just hope that isn't too big a cut, actually, given the fact we've had a good run. Yeah, what does the future hold? Sorry, that was a bit waffly, wasn't it? But anyway, whatever.
No, that's fine. I think all I would say in that, it is a very large reduction. That is absolutely true. But it is also a large increase in prudence as well. In particular, the 10% reserve is holding a pretty significant portion of that improvement back. And that gives you explicit protection against some of these factors. From the funding side, obviously, you know the exposure on the investment side, which I agree with. As I said before, the single biggest driver of the cost of the scheme and the cost of providing benefits is your investment performance relative to inflation. And so if that weakens, if that's not where you expect it to be, then your scheme gets significantly more expensive quite quickly, excuse me. All I can say to that is you have held back a lot to protect yourself against that, again, within the discount rate and also within the funding reserve. The final point to make there, I think, is absolutely those are risks, and those are risks that the fund should, of course, be worrying about. I think what this plan does do is strike a reasonable balance against comparing those risks with the funding pressures that the employers are facing at the moment, which is also a significant and excuse me, entirely relevant consideration as well. I think this plan, it does a good amount for the employers now in terms of a sensible reduction, significant reduction, but it also means the fund has done as much as it reasonably can, in my view, to leave itself in a position to maintain those reductions, or if they can't be maintained, then, and I think this is crucial, that any increases can be done in a sensible and controlled way. Hope that covers it.
Thank you for that. Any other questions? No. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that presentation and the answers to the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
On to item 6, pensions administration monitoring.
Thank you, Chair. Conscious of time, I know we've still got quite a lot of the agenda to get through, so not going to go through this report line by line, and just want to pick up the recommendations with you. So members are asked to note the KPI chart and information on the KPIs that are not currently meeting the 95% target, and the actions that are being taken to address this. We're also asked to note the key activities on our business plan. Happy to kind of comment on that everything that we are due to be doing is either completed or on track. And to note, obviously, the progress on the pension dashboard programme, where we have actually connected to the dashboard, which we had to do by the end of October. And we are continuing to do work to improve data to help when members actually are able to log into the dashboard and access their information. Other things to note in the report, obviously, you can see all of the work of the admin team, and it always kind of admin comes in the middle of all the investment stuff, and it's kind of just trying to remember that the admin side, if we're not collecting the money from members or paying out benefits, we're the customer facing service of the pensions fund, but also collection of that contribution money coming in. If we're not collecting that, it's not there to invest. So that's what my team does. They collect the money in, they also pay out the benefits to members. So not to kind of lose focus on that, because there's a lot of investment talk in these meetings. So the other thing in this report to note, we were asked to give you information on new registrations for our online portal. And also to note that as we talk about cash flow, that the pensions increase for April next year has been confirmed, and that will be 3.8% next year. So the fund will have to look for that extra cash to pay those increases on pensions from April next year. So that was a quick run through. I'm happy to take any questions, but conscious obviously we've got lots on the agenda to get through.
Any questions, Malcolm?
Yeah, hopefully. Well, quick question. On Appendix A, deferred benefits options communication stands out as a low percentage. Any particular reason why that is the way it is?
So that area of work is high volume. We have recruited new members of staff to help with that workload. So we have actually moved from 2 individuals to 4 individuals working on that. So we've seen a bit of an improvement, but we need to see more improvement on that. We're also looking at functionality where we can bulk process that, so automate some of the process a bit more. But generally, this is the biggest area of work. So these are early leavers, so they're leaving before their pension is due. And we get lots of people kind of coming and going in jobs. Whereas in the past, people would tend to stay in a job for quite a long time. We've got more kind of coming and going more frequently. So it bumps up that workload there.
Any other questions on that report? Okay, we'll take the recommendations 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 all together. Do we have a proposal for those, please? Alan, seconded. Welcome. All those in favour? That's unanimous. Thank you. Move on to item 7, corporate governance monitoring and dispute.
Thank you, Chair.
So yeah, this is just your standard report that you get each quarter. We did, as following Malcolm's request, try to look at putting links in to avoid putting the paper attachments in as appendices. Unfortunately, we couldn't get stability to that at the moment. So we're still working through that. We will look to, like you say, to try and reduce the number of paper documents within the pack by giving you links to the appendices from Central, LAPF and Columbia Threadneedle as things progress. In terms of those, I've gone through in terms of the report. I've pulled out the companies that actually relate to our portfolio, because as you're aware from previous talks, those are general reports rather than specific to our investments. So I tried to pull out the ones that relate to the portfolio for your attention. I've also included an update on where we are in terms of the conflicts and whether there's been any progress with SAB. Unfortunately, at this particular moment in time, SAB is still waiting for a response from government on conflict-affected areas. That said, we're not dropping it off our agenda. It's still something that's very much we're aware of and we're trying to keep on top of. We're trying to consider whether...
Apologies. There aren't ducks in the room, honestly.
So, yeah, so hopefully come the next quarter, we'll be able to give you a more detailed update on that and whether that requires any changes to our statement that we've already made on investments in conflict affected areas. And then the final point is just around the changes to the local government pension scheme and the Fit for the Future consultation. So as an interim measure, I sent out after the 30th of September the position of what LGPS Central was likely to look like on the 1st of April. There's not really much more to add to it at this particular moment in time. The Isle of Wight, which was the only outstanding council at that particular or pension fund at that time to make a decision, that's still in progress. There's been no memorandum of understanding signed with Central at this particular moment in time, so that still remains to be sorted. Since writing this report, the actual pension schemes bill itself cleared its hurdle in the Commons. That will now progress to the House of Lords. MHCLG and the Treasury are convinced that they will have it in place by 1st of April. I'm not convinced. We'll wait and see what happens on this particular thing. What they will probably do is, even if it can't be in place, they will expect all funds still to work on a best endeavours basis on the grounds that it's expected to pass at some point and gain royal assent. What they have done in the interim is, normally when a bill passes, they would issue the regulations and ask for consultation on the regulations at that particular point. What they've done as an advance measure is, given that the bill's still going through, they've actually issued draft regulations at this stage. And that covers both the administration side of things in terms of how we actually govern the fund, and the investment side of things in terms of how we actually transfer the investments to LGPS Central. I'm working through. It literally, that consultation came out just before these papers. I'm working through that consultation at the moment, and working through it with our advisors and also with the other partner funds within LGPS Central, so that we can try and create a consolidated response to that. And what I'll do is, there's a deadline for that. They've set quite nicely of the 2nd of January, so get a nice Christmas period. But we will look to share that with the chair in advance of the deadline, and then that will be fully reported to the committee at the next meeting in March. But I'm happy to take any questions on any of those issues at the moment. Yeah.
Just a quick one, really, with regards to the government stance and LGPS's stance on conflicts and investments. Once that has been, we've got confirmation on that. Is that something we can publish prior to our meeting? The only reason I say that is because we've had 2 questions upon it prior to this meeting, so I think it is something that's in the public eye, and I think it's something that we need to be aware of and address for our members.
I totally agree. I think we're in the process of actually reviewing the contents of the Shropshire County Pension Fund website to make sure that, like I say, we make things like that as transparent as possible, and that they're not actually hidden away. They're easily accessible by members. I think sometimes we have documents on there, but sometimes they're hard to actually find and access. So we're going through that process at the moment of actually reviewing the contents of the entire website. Certainly the investments issues are also top of that list.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
I've got Alan first, then Malcolm.
My question doesn't relate to that report specifically, but to general governance. It might be something that you want to answer now, or it might be something you want to bring up in the next report in a quarter. But it's about the security of the defined benefit pension scheme on the whole. So the media has widely reported that Reform, and especially Richard Tice, say that they would scrap defined benefit pension schemes and convert them to defined contribution instead. And such changes would be deeply unjust to those who have saved thousands into the scheme during the years of public service, and it may drive some into poverty during their retirement. So what protection is in place that ensures that the Shropshire pension scheme, it would prevent that happening to the Shropshire pension scheme? And that's guarding against political threats at a Shropshire Council level. Should an administration take over at Shropshire Council that wanted to produce that at a pool level, other councils within our pool, and also at a central government level?
I'm going to give this a try, because it's you'll well know with central government politics, it's if they don't like the rules, they just go and change them and bring out a bill like they've just done with what we're going through at the moment. which makes sometimes, I think, illegal things legal, which is a bit bizarre, isn't it, really? In terms of the DB nature of the fund, while it obviously can't turn around and say what Machiavellian thing might come out of that, what has happened historically where an employer has decided, normally in the private sector, to move over to DC to remove their own risk as an employer as such, is that they close the DB scheme to new entrants and effectively create a new DC scheme for new members. I'd like to think if they went down that route, that would be the way forward. But that will be, as I say, really subject to whatever Machiavellian thing that might just appear, because we've had 10 plus years now in the LGPS of coping with, frankly, political interference in what we do. The LGPS is a fantastic scheme, and it is funded, unlike other government schemes. So there are a heck of a lot of strengths in there. And I know this is recorded, what have you, I'll say it anyway. I just wish central government would stop trying to rob the LGPS.
That answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going back to the point about the conflict areas and the Appendix D in Section 7. So I think there's sort of two things. Obviously, Shropshire County Pension Fund can have a policy about conflict areas. But as it says in here, 3/4 of the assets are with LGPS Central, which has its own policy. And given the increasing number of funds in LGPS Central, the expansion of it, our voice, if you like, is diminished. So how would we, if we choose to, how can we make sure that policies at the Shropshire County level are reflected in the LGPS Central level? And I'm not sure who that question is for.
I can start to take it. So obviously we work very closely with Central in terms of actually trying to develop that policy. As a committee under this new bill, what we will have the ability to do is to actually set our strategic asset allocation and our investment beliefs. And therefore, it's very much important that through those investment beliefs, we actually set exactly what we define in terms of responsible investment. So in the past, when we set our investment strategy statement, we've set our beliefs around our investments at a fairly high level. Now, it may be that going forwards, we actually have to set those at a much more granular level to actually specify exactly what the beliefs of Shropshire County Pension Fund are, so that they do not get lost within, like you say, the wider LGPS Central views of things. Those will be things that we will pick up as part of that training in January, when we're actually looking at the strategy and we're looking at what makes up our investments and what makes up the beliefs that actually sit behind those investments as to why we're actually choosing those particular investments and why we're actually choosing that particular allocation. I don't know if you've got anything to add yourself, Ashley.
I'm probably not the best person to speak on behalf of LGPS Central, but from the way LGPS Central as a pool work, we do a lot of collaboration and consultation with our partner funds. All of our policies are basically a result of consultation with our 8 partner funds. And in the future, we will continue to consult with our 15 partner funds when that happens, before coming up with a statement or a policy. The reason being is we are managing on behalf of these 15 partner funds. We need to make sure that when we manage the funds, it needs to reflect the views of our partner funds. And that's the way we have been operating in the past, and it will continue to be the way how we operate in the future.
Charles.
This question raises a lot of interesting issues. I'm not that familiar with the LGPS yet, but it seems to me it's increasingly a vehicle for focusing the investment funds that are available into one vehicle, which is much more easily exploited or managed by the government. And personally, I'm against that kind of development. If we're going to have an investment fund, it should be independent of the government, as it has in the past been. But I've had some experience, quite a lot of experience with the transfer of pension funds from being defined benefit funds, being defined contribution funds. All of my experience has been exactly the process you described, where the one fund was closed, and those kind of benefits were frozen for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And going forward, there'll be a different basis for the defined contribution funds. And I would imagine, we don't know, of course, because when it comes to politics, everything is fluid. But I would imagine that in the future, what will happen is that exactly the same procedure would apply to the government funds. It'd be very difficult to take away a benefit which is been earned by most employees, see their pensions as deferred earnings, as how the courts treat it as deferred earnings, and straightforward theft of that, I think, which is not on the cards. The difficulty for the government might be the different treatment, because clearly it's easier to deal with a fully funded plan because the funds are there, no extra burden on the taxpayer as such. They might have to take a different approach with the unfunded plans, because they're if you freeze that scheme, you do have a future liability to measure somehow and to manage. I probably could be done quite easily by saying, well, at the moment it's a future charge on taxes, and it will continue to be a future charge on taxes. The main difference will be the future, how those future pension costs are going to be collected and distributed, and I think that will probably follow the private sector method. That's my guess, but it's a waste of time speculating about it when it's 4 years away at least. Thank you.
Not quite sure if there was a question in there, Charles, but if anybody has got any comeback on that. Any other questions?
I mean, I think the only thing I would add to that is clearly there's the angle of a government doing a Royal Mail, which is basically saying we'll have the assets, but we'll deal with the liabilities. Something the size of the LGPS, really? Don't think so. I don't think that's the direction of travel, but that is being talked about a number of times over. That yeah, they could just sweep up the assets of the LGPS and say, yeah, we'll sort your pensions out. In effect, turn it into an unfunded scheme. But I don't really want to go there. That's the wrong way to go.
Okay. Any other questions on this item? No. So we'll take the recommendations 3.1, 3.2 and 3.3. We have a proposal for those, please. Yep, Zona. Seconded. I'll second. All those in favour? That's majority. Thank you.
Before we move on, Chair, Malcolm, I know you did have a question on the Glencore response that was issued following the climate
the next one is
You're going to
up there.
Okay, fine. No problems.
So just wait.
The best is yet to come.
Well, no.
Is poised. So we move on to item 8. 2025 Climate Risk Management Report, including a TCFD report, and that's Ethan and Bashar, please.
Thank you, Chair. And we are very, very pleased to be here today to present the 2025 Climate Risk Report for the fund. And sure. Yeah. Since we began doing this in 2020, considerable improvements have been made. The fund's understanding of how its investment is affected by and have an effect to climate has undoubtedly increased, and we'll briefly talk about what the fund has done since then in this presentation. We presented most of these slides and results in the climate training 2 weeks ago, but we'll go through them again for the benefit of committee members who are not in the meeting, and or if anyone in the any public guests from online. And of course, most of this information and a lot of what we talked about 2 weeks ago can be found in the report, which is after the which is in the meeting pack, right after the presentation slides. The next slide, please. So this is our climate dashboard. Sorry, the one before, 112. Yeah. This is our climate dashboard. If you have not seen it before, basically this is just to showcase the tools at our disposal to identify, assess, and ultimately manage our exposure to climate risk. It is a very busy dashboard. We have a plethora of metrics that we look at because we don't think there's one single metric to explain how a fund is exposed to climate. And it's also gives us a great overview of where the risk stems from and how to manage it. For example, we can drill down into each manager and see their progress. And we also have a top 10 emissions contributors list there. So it informs us as to which companies we should focus our engagement on. But for the purpose of today, we will focus on 3 core metrics at the top table there, which is finance emissions, normalized finance emissions, and weighted average carbon intensity, which measures the absolute amount of emissions that we finance through our investment activities, the intensity of our emissions, basically the quantity of emissions for every penny that we invest, and our exposure to high emitting companies and sectors. And Ethan will go through the next few slides.
Perfect. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Yeah, thank you, Basha, and good morning, everybody. So next slide, please. So making a start on climate metrics over time. So this data is taken directly from the CRMS data dashboard that was presented on the previous slide. So to discuss some of the data seen available on this slide, we'll first look at the trajectory of climate metrics. So looking at the trajectory here, you can see on the chart, this trajectory is what we would expect and we have seen with our other partner funds. The bulk of the decarbonisation happened in 2022 when the fund diversified into LGIM, Low Carbon Transition, and LGPS Climate Multi-Factor Funds. Since then, global emissions have been sticky, judging by what the composite benchmark or reference index has done. The data here shows that the products are fulfilling their purpose, that is delivering close to market returns while reducing exposure to climate transition and physical risks. To discuss some of the data in a bit more detail, firstly, financed emissions are down 34.5% versus 2020 and then 62% versus the reference index. So secondly, normalised financed emissions have fallen even further at 64.8% versus 2020 and then 65.2% versus the reference index. An overarching point of financed emissions will be that they've flatlined since 2022. It is also important to consider what we mean that we need to be mindful not to let the decarbonisation trajectory dictate the investments. Final point on this slide is that both priorities must move together, otherwise we risk ending up with a clean portfolio that carries too much tracking error. Next slide, please. So now moving on to the second part of the climate metrics over time for listed equities. Here we are focusing on listed equity, weighted average carbon intensity, also known as WACC. Now this is a similar trajectory for WACC as we have seen in the previous slide. We're favourable of WACC because it shows exposure to high emitting companies, which means looking at the data presented on this slide, it means the fund has tilted away from high risk sectors. This can be particularly attributed to decreased WACC in the hard to abate sectors of utilities, materials and energy sectors, which have decreased by 67%, 49% and 46% respectively. Although this can mean companies are becoming more efficient and less carbon intensive, which is what we would prefer to see. Next slide, please. So moving on to this slide, showing progress against climate targets, we can see target number 1, net zero scope 1 and 2 carbon equivalent in terms of CO2 equivalent financed emissions by 2050 or sooner for listed equities, corporate bonds, sovereign debt and property. And target number 2 is a 50% reduction of Scope 1 and 2 CO2 equivalent financed emissions by 2030 for listed equities and corporate bonds. Progress against these targets is a 34.5% decrease in listed equities financed emissions since 2020. And the final target on this page is carbon footprinting and reporting against all public and private market assets. Progress against these targets is that in 2024, carbon footprinting was established for all pooled private market assets using both actual and estimated data. So back in 2022, the fund has set a target to manage its exposure to physical and transition risk based on the latest assessment. The fund target is on track. LGPS Central has done a lot of work around footprinting assets, and then since 2024, data availability has significantly improved, and we are looking to expand this to other assets in the future. Next slide, please. So moving on to climate stewardship plan. So these 6 companies are some of the largest contributors to the fund's financed emissions. As such, we have placed them onto our priority list. So firstly, for each priority company, LGPS Central will engage directly with clear objectives and progress management. Secondly, we will utilise all of our stewardship tools, such as engagement and voting, to support objectives. Where we are with each company can be seen on the table on screen. And finally, we continue to engage with these companies using our internal measures, and we expect to continue progress in the future. Next slide, please. So moving on to this slide here, this presents an engagement activity with one of our priority companies, that is Shell PLC. So this is one example of an engagement activity with a priority company. So as you can see on the slide on screen, we set short-term and long-term objectives. Our engagements with each company will inform us of progress reaching those objectives, and /or if the objectives are still relevant. Each year we measure the outcome of these engagement activities and mark their progress as per what you've seen on the table in the previous slide. And a final point on this slide, it is important to consider that we set short-term and long-term objectives and to measure progress. If progress is limited, we progress onto levels 3 and 4 of our engagement framework, which can include votes against management. Thank you. I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Basha, who's going to take you through key takeaways.
I think the conclusion is, and we're very consistent with this, it has been the same in the past years as well, is that the fund is very aware of how its investment is affected by and have an impact to climate, partially because we've been doing this since 2020, and in 2022, the fund have established objectives and targets to manage and diversify into products that will help it manage climate risk. We will continue to do this. We will have additional assessments down the line. I think the actuaries will conduct a climate scenario analysis in their triennial valuation, and then we'll reassess as to whether we need to do additional activities around climate risk. And then each year we'll come back and we'll do this, so the committee will continue to be informed as to the progress, and we will continue to educate and give training when need be. That's all.
This is my question. Right. So at the climate training we had a couple of weeks ago, I queried about Glencore being sitting in this group here, and there was Peter shared a document talks about Glencore and why it is part of that, and basically saying we'd rather have them inside the tent than outside, so that we can put some leverage on them. If you look at the climate stewardship plan slide, it shows progress level 0 for Glencore. So basically, it's not working for them. Question about some of the other ones, the Shells and the BPs, etc. But it appears that there's some leverage and some things moving, but Glencore, nothing. Would you like to comment on that?
Admittedly, Glencore has been quite a difficult company to engage with. They don't really want to engage with CA100+, which is a collective group. But recently, they have been engaging directly with us, and we have had a few conversations with the company to understand their views on their climate targets and or to include the new acquisition of the tech resources steelmaking coal into the next round of climate strategy, which is they might probably publish a new one next year, because when they did it last year, they did not include the new assets, or they might publish a separate policy just for the steel making. So these are the type of progress we get from being able to engage with the companies directly. And I'm pleased to say that we have opened a direct dialogue with Glencore outside of CA 100 plus, and they do listen to shareholders and investors. They just do not want to engage with a collective engagement group like CA 100 plus. That's just their view. But as long as we continue to engage with them, having dialogue with them directly, hopefully we will see progress, and we will obviously also hold them to account with their own current strategy and their strategy. A lot of their strategy relies upon them phasing out and closing their coal mines, the thermal coal mines, and we will continue to track whether or not they are sticking to their plans. And if they don't, obviously we will have to use our levers to vote against management, on vote against directors. Those are the type of things which we will do.
Just sort of follow on from that. So yeah, they're the second largest contribution to the financial emissions on here. And if that progress stays at level 0, at what point do we pull the plug? We collectively, I don't know whether it's the council or LGPS Central or something that says actually it is no longer, it doesn't suit sitting in this funding group.
I think you would find that most of our exposure to Glencore is through passive funds, and we do have one holdings through our actively managed funds, global equity active funds. The reality is that as we get closer to 2030, 2040, 2050, the likelihood and potentially the impact of climate will increase. And if our manager thinks the risk reward is not in favor, they will probably naturally divest from a company like Glencore. It is the same with any other oil and gas or any other high emitting company. When the likelihood of physical and transition risk is higher, and you're not being paid in terms of potential returns from the investments, the active managers will probably take a view and divest from it. But we're not there yet. I think one of our managers have a very strong thesis on the value of Glencore, and we will continue to monitor and engage with that manager directly to understand whether their views have changed, and if they do change, we will report back to the committee.
Yeah, my question was similar to Malcolm's in terms of but it's more about the flexibility in the investment. Is there instantaneous ability for the investment managers to divest at a point where they feel it's the right thing to be doing, despite the sort of overall policy of LGPS being more an engagement strategy, simply because things with individual companies can be very fluid in terms of share price, and if they are giving indication that they're not going to work on ESG targets, or if we get closer and closer to the point where fossil fuel companies' prices start to go down because there's less demand for oil or coal or anything else, we need to be ahead of that curve, not reacting once the prices are already started to drop. So is there flexibility there for that to happen?
I'll try to tackle this. There's two lenses to look at this. One is the passively managed funds, and the other one is on the active funds. On the passive funds, the reality is that managers will probably continue to hold if it's in the index, because their mandate is actually to track the benchmark. And as long as Glencore fits into the benchmark rules, they will continue to hold Glencore in their funds. I would say as well, though, that Glencore is not in any of the climate tilted benchmarks, because our index providers aren't able to include Glencore in their benchmark and still follow the rules as to the targets 60% below reference index and whatnot. So they weren't able to optimize Glencore into the benchmark, and because of that, you won't see Glencore for now in the LGIM low carbon transition and also our LGPS Central Economic Multi-Factor Fund. But they are still in the UK equity passive funds because it is a big constituent of the UK benchmark. On the active funds, yes, there is flexibility to our investment managers. We give them full flexibility to pick and buy or sell stocks as they see fit. We just make sure that they are aware of climate risk in their stock picks. We test them on their views on how they include physical transition climate risk into their valuation. And we continue to engage with our managers very regularly. We look at daily data on pricing. We speak to them monthly, quarterly, annually to understand their views on each stock pick. And when they change their views and they sell, they can sell it without consulting us beforehand. So like I said, when the managers think the risk reward is not appropriate for it to be in their portfolios, they don't have to consult us. They can just sell it.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Charles.
I would expect you to have a good idea as to how many shares we actually own in Shell, as an example. And I guess that interest may come through various channels, through investment channels, but collectively we should have a good idea as to what the total exposure to Shell is. And I'm just wondering if you happen to know what proportion of the issued shares of Shell our interest would be. Are we talking about 10%, 5%, 1%, 0.001%? Do we know?
It's probably closer to 0.001%.
Yeah. Last time I looked at the figures for Shell, which is 20 years ago, so I'm out of date. But at that time, 20% of the shares were owned by Americans, who are a lot more robust about their investment strategies than we are, perhaps. I would suggest that any attempt by us to influence Shell into the overall policies in terms of ESG or anything else is pretty marginal. And I would wonder whether or not we're just wasting, well, not we, but you are simply wasting money in trying to do this. But maybe it's just smoke and mirrors. Over to you.
The way we view engagement is both ways. We try to influence, but we also try to understand the companies a lot more in their thinking on issues like climate, or if they operate in conflict areas, we try to understand their views on and what they are doing in terms of managing those risks. And then from that engagement, it feeds back into our investment thesis, and we will make decisions on our investments. Then it doesn't necessarily just for us to influence. We're not here to tell management of companies how to run their business, because they are probably we hope they are the right persons to run the business. But by engaging and continue to communicate with the companies, having dialogue with management of companies, we can understand whether the next time there's an election of management, for example, we can understand whether these are the right people in the business, and we can vote accordingly. And also we can vote with our investments if we don't think after engaging with these companies that they are the right people to run the business, and or they're not tackling issues which are material to us in a way that we think it should be tackled, we can vote with divesting from these companies when the risk reward is not the right, we're not getting the right returns from taking the risk.
I'm sorry, I don't want to waste your time. My question was largely rhetorical.
Any more questions? Are we okay with that? Okay, we'll move